So what I'm going to talk today about is empty gestures. And as an example of what I mean by empty gestures, I will give you a demonstration by the master of the empty gesture, Larry David, on Curb Your Enthusiasm.
Hey, how's your sister, by the way?
Bam Bam?
Yeah.
Thanks for asking. She's doing a lot better.
Really?
Yeah, I'm really glad we took her out of that mental institution.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I'm excited.
You know, if there's anything I can do, you let me know.
You know what? There is something you can do.
What?
Yeah, you could come over today at 1 o'clock and visit with her.
Visit her?
Yeah.
What, are you kidding?
Why, you didn't mean it?
Of course not.
Why did you say it then?
You know, it was an empty gesture. It was something to say.
Guess what? You said it. Be there at 1 o'clock.
All right. So this is an excellent example of what I'm going to be talking about today because, as Larry says, it was something to say, as though he's simply following the script of altruism without really thinking he's incurring any cost or doing anything to benefit others. And I'm calling this phenomenon placebic altruism as an ode to Ellen Langer's notion of placebic information. So Langer talked about placebic information as information that follows the script of being meaningful but is in fact meaningless. What I mean by placebic altruism is actions that follow the script of altruism with no cost to the self and no benefit to others. And why Langer says these phenomena occur is because we typically process information in a mindless fashion. More specifically, what I'm going to ask today is, does placebic altruism operate similarly to actual altruism in a particular way, with regard to how altruism interacts with selfishness? And what we know from decades of research in psychology is that many times selfishness can ironically lead to altruism, and altruism, ironically, can lead to selfishness. Why does that balancing act occur? It occurs because of two processes. One is what I'll call moral compensation or cleansing, where we do something selfish. This reduces our positive self-image of ourselves that we like to maintain. So to repair our self-image, we'll do something altruistic or more moral at a later point in time to sort of restore our self-image. The flip side of this process is what's known as moral licensing, where we'll do something very moral, we'll behave in an altruistic fashion. This makes us feel like we've sort of fulfilled our moral quota for the day. We've given ourselves moral credits, and this can then lead us to sort of slack off morally, behaving more selfishly at a later point in time. So what I'm asking is, does the equilibrium that we see between altruism and selfishness apply even to placebic altruism? In other words, is there a correlation between placebic, meaningless acts of altruism and consequential acts of selfishness? Now, how we measure placebic altruism in the majority of our studies is using a very strange task that we developed by accident. It looks like a very simple task, but it gets a little strange here. So, what this task consists of is people online or in the lab play our game. And our game is a multi-trial, sort of modified dictator game where you get a bunch of trials, and on every trial you're asked the same question. Which would you prefer? I get some amount of money, or my partner gets some amount of money. And by the way, everyone's told they're matched up with an anonymous partner, and that one of these trials will randomly be actually implemented. So all of these trials involve real money. Okay? So one trial might say, which would you prefer? I get $3.77 or my partner gets $2.88. I get $1 or my partner gets $1. This is all pretty normal so far, but interspersed in these normal trials are oddball trials that we call 0 versus 0 trials, because these are trials on which you have to make the choice, what would you rather do? I get $0 or my partner gets $0. Okay? And I say we developed this task on accident because my collaborator on this, Jamil Zaki, and we were first giving people this game to play while in an fMRI scanner. So people would be in the fMRI scanner, they'd be making their choices. We'd be in the other room, and we could see what choices they were making. And what we started to see is that rather than treat these 0 versus 0 trials in a random fashion, we started seeing that they were behaving in a somewhat systematic fashion, which is that they were treating the partner gets 0 choice as giving, because it followed the script of altruism that you see on all of these other trials. Okay? And you might say, this is very bizarre. In the light of day, we might look at this trial as third-party observers and say, that doesn't make any sense. Actually, the I get 0 trial is more generous because you're taking nothing for yourselves. And so in order to validate our assumptions about this, we've conducted a few studies where instead of actually having people make decisions on what to do on this trial, we'll give them a variety of different trials and we'll ask them to make a snap decision under 1 second, which choice is more generous, okay? And a significant majority, we've done this a number of times, says the partner gets trial is more generous because they're under speeded conditions. It follows the script of altruism. It sounds sort of generous. Furthermore, the tendency to say partner gets 0 is generous increases when you present this 0-0 trial later in the set. So the more accustomed people are to answering, yeah, partner gets is the generous choice, partner gets is the generous choice, the more mindless this situation becomes, the more people see this as the generous choice. And we're assuming that in the studies I'm about to show you, people are operating in a relatively mindless fashion, going through a lot of trials. Okay? Now, the important studies that I'm going to turn to now are those that demonstrate that this act of engaging in this placebic altruism of saying, yeah, I'll give my partner $0, is actually consequentially correlated with real selfishness. So how do we measure this? In a first study, we had 91 participants play a 195 trial version of our game, where there are 180 consequential trials with real numerical amounts, and 15 of these 0 versus 0 trials interspersed. Everyone's told that they're playing with an anonymous partner. One of their choices will be randomly implemented, so this is real money at stake. We measure placebic altruism then by the number of times on these 15 0 versus 0 trials people choose partner gets. So people have a maximum of 15 points on our placebic altruism measure, a minimum of 0. And then we simply measure selfishness by looking at the 180 consequential trials and looking at the number of times, the sum of the times that people say, I get money on these consequential trials. We can also measure selfishness by looking at the actual monetary amounts that people allocate to themselves versus others over the course of the game. That measure of selfishness is correlated with this sum measure at about 0.99, so all the results are the same. For ease of illustration, I'll just present our sum measure. Now what we find very simply on this task is on the x-axis, the more that people select partner gets on the 0-0 trials, the more they're selecting I get on the selfish trials. This is a modest but statistically significant correlation that checks out when we use dollar amount as our measure of selfishness as well. Initial evidence that placebic altruism links up with consequential selfishness. But what we haven't done here is tested whether placebic altruism is driving selfishness or selfishness is driving placebic altruism. Because of the way that our trials are randomized, we can't exactly test for that. So in study 2, we wanted to test this moral compensation process by inducing people to experience selfishness. All right? So we took 63 participants, randomly assigned them to either experience selfishness or not. In our selfish condition, we adapted methods from Doug Medine and Keith Murnian, who have ran similar studies. We asked people to simply write about recent ways you've spent money on yourself for leisure and luxury. In our selfless condition, the other half of our participants were asked to write about ways that they've spent money on others. And our expectation is that, consistent with moral compensation, when people are reminded of being selfish, they'll want to repair that moral self-image by engaging in altruism. We expect that when given the chance, they'll engage in placebic altruism. So, again, we have people play our task. This is an abridged version of the task with just 16 trials. 12 are consequential, 4 are 0 versus 0. Here, the maximum placebic altruism score is 4. Selfishness is measured in the exact same way as in the previous study. And first, before I look at the data by condition, I'll just collapse over condition to show you we completely replicate the correlation from study 1, where the more people are choosing partner gets on the placebic trials, the more they're choosing I get on the consequential trials. Then, when we look at placebic altruism by condition, what we see is borne out in the predictions we had, which is that when people are reminded of being selfish, they engage in more time saying, partner gets 0 on these 0 versus 0 trials. And very interestingly, there's no effect on the consequential trials of conditions. So what we think is going on here is that when reminded of selfishness, people want to engage in this moral self-repair. And what we've done is we've given them a low-cost way of doing so that wipes out the effect of doing so on the consequential trials. All right, I didn't know this would be going so quickly, so I'm going to turn to an entirely different paradigm now to explain how this phenomenon can operate in the opposite direction, where placebic altruism can actually license selfishness. So here we're going to be looking at a different form of placebic altruism, but the idea is the same. It's going to be a gesture that sort of follows the script of doing something generous. Here we had a larger online study, and the idea here is that if we can get people to engage in placebic altruism, this might actually license them to behave more selfishly at a subsequent point in time. So we randomly assigned half of our participants, about half, to our placebic condition, and in the placebic condition, the first thing that participants saw was a message from the experimenters that said, before you begin, we could really use your help on a task, a verbal task that we're piloting for another study. We really need people to help us out with this. Will you help? And everyone says yes, that we looked at. Now the second they say yes, they advance onto a second screen on the computer where they receive a message that says, thanks very much for agreeing to help. Our quota has been met. We actually don't need your help after all. Very different form of placebic altruism here. We've given them the chance to say, yes, I'll help, but really there's no cost to them, there's no benefit to others. In the control condition, we simply avoid this song and dance altogether. We just say, thanks for signing up, please proceed to the next section of the study. The next section of the study then is given to all participants in all conditions. And what that consists of is a very dull task where we tell people we'd really like your help proofreading a passage from this dull chemistry textbook. Will you help us out by circling, identifying all the words in this passage that contain the letter E? Our dependent variable then is not giving, as in the previous studies, but it's helping. How much do people help us? And the expectation is that when people had gone through the sort of minimal act of saying, yeah, I'll help, but then our quota's been met, they'll feel like they've fulfilled their moral quota and they don't have to help on this subsequent task, which is indeed borne out in the data. So in the control condition, on average, people help us by identifying about 100 words on average. But when people had been made to go through this little placebic gesture, that drops to about 63 words per person. All right, so to summarize, what we think we've found here, and I understand this is open to some interpretation, is that people treat giving $0 as giving. Giving $0 correlates with taking actual amounts of money for myself, and reminding people of their own selfish ways increases people's tendency to give $0 more. Finally, what we start to see evidence for with this final study is that minimal placebic acts of altruism can license selfishness as well. And so some of the academics, the psychologists in the room, might be saying, wait, there's this whole other literature in psychology on consistency, where altruism doesn't necessarily lead to selfishness. Selfishness doesn't necessarily lead to altruism. Sometimes selfishness begets selfishness. Sometimes altruism begets altruism. And maybe you're just misinterpreting your findings. It's possible, but why we believe that placebic altruism is behaving as actual altruism is because of recent work by Gnesi and Imus and others. That's consistent with some older work by Ravi Dar that shows that when you get these balancing effects of altruism leading to selfishness and selfishness leading to altruism is when low-cost behaviors are at stake, because they're not really a signal to yourself. When you get consistency effects is when high-stakes behaviors are at stake. And clearly, in the present studies, we're giving people a chance to engage in these low-cost gestures, which is why we think our results are consistent with the Gnesi et al. Findings. So, some implications for giving and charitable appeals. What we think we've shown is that compensation and licensing apply as much to meaningless behaviors of prosociality as they do to meaningful behaviors of prosociality. And when given the opportunity, people might tend to do the bare minimum to preserve their moral self-image. The cautionary tale here is that I think a lot of small gestures that charities give people a chance to engage in, so share this video, like us on Facebook, tweet this out to your friends, what is cynically known as slacktivism. This can sometimes impede more consequential charitable efforts. I don't mean to sort of make light of these efforts. We also know there's a literature on foot-in-the-door effects, where small gestures lead to large ones. But what I want to suggest is that we want to avoid giving people low-cost, placebic opportunities simultaneous to more high-cost opportunities. Putting this all into action, here's a solicitation letter I found online for a particular charitable cause, where it gives people 3 options. 1, donate some money to cover costs. 2, donate some money to get these materials to others. Or 3 is an option where you circle, sorry, I can't afford to pay anything, but please send me materials. I promise to get materials out efficiently. Thank you. All right? Now, there's nothing wrong with this third option. But based on what I'm arguing, I think by including this third option next to the more consequential options, what you're giving people a chance to do is taking the low-cost effort way of preserving their moral self-image. All right? So this is a very cynical talk. I want to turn from empty gestures to sincere ones and thank my dear collaborator, Jamil Zaki, on this project, as well as SPI. And thanks all of you. Chris.
I understand, like in Atlanta's experiment, I want to use the copier because I want to use the copier.
Right.
This is really meaningless.
Right.
But in this case, in your cases, for example, in your video and your third experiment, it's not meaningless. I'm writing you a check, and you don't use my check. It's your copy. So what I have is not an empty gesture. I put my reputation at stake because I'm writing you a check. I told you I'm willing to help. And if you really want me to help, if I say no, then my reputation is at stake. So it's a real gesture, not an empty gesture. So this is sort of a, this is not totally meaningless. But on the flip side, more applied side, I think this is a totally different comment.
Sure.
I think it would be interesting to induce people to do something good by first asking people, are you willing to, if I can give you $300, are you willing to take it? And I say yes. No, there's no such $100. Then are you willing to donate? So you do exactly the opposite to induce people to say something selfish, and then maybe do to balance it from what we're going to do later on. That can be an interesting application. So really, these are 2 different questions.
All I'll say in response to the second point is I love that idea. It's a great idea. I would like to implement that. To your first point, you're right. This isn't a completely empty gesture. It's not that they're incurring no cost. They're making a promise. And maybe I'm using the term placebic altruism for a particular reason in line with what Langer talks about. Maybe it's not exactly the same as saying something completely meaningless. But what I do think is that it's there's no cost to the giver in the end, and there's nothing gained by anything else. So maybe we should call that something else. It's not a completely empty gesture, but it's a pretty minimal gesture. It's sort of how low can licensing go? Pretty low. Thank you.